Hello, I'm Rebecca Weber. You're watching Better for America, presented by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. Joining me today is Ambassador Andrew Bremberg. He is the president of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. He previously served as assistant to President Trump and director of the Domestic Policy Council. And we have a great episode coming up about how communism impacts the world around us, even here in the United States. So stay tuned.
The Association of Mature American Citizens is the conservative voice for Americans 50 and older. AMAC is fighting for the values that you hold dear. Join today. Together, we can write the course of America.
So to begin, I'd like for you to tell our listeners who are not familiar with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation what you offer and what the goal is for this great foundation.
Well, thanks for having me with you today. It's great to talk with you and all your listeners. So here at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, we are dedicated to remembering all the more than 100 million victims of communism who have suffered and died under these evil regimes, and to fight for the freedom of the more than 1.5 billion people still living under communism today. Our foundation was chartered by the U.S. Congress nearly 30 years ago at the end of the fall of the Soviet Union, at a time where Americans thought all those victims would be in the past. And sadly, as we know, we continue to see millions of victims around the world today. And our foundation has focused on building a memorial that was dedicated here in Washington 15 years ago, opening a brand new museum here in Washington, D.C. last summer, educating Americans around the country about communism, both past and in the present, and focusing on our work on our China research program that I think is one of the best research programs in the United States today, examining and showing the human rights abuses taking place in China today.
I would love for you to educate our listeners on the true nature of communism, why it is the deadliest ideology in history, and why people are falling victim to the false promises of Marxist socialism and communism.
So communism is clearly the most murderous and evil ideology we as humans have ever dealt with or imposed upon ourselves or one another. In the last century and through today, more than 100 million people have been killed by communist regimes. The worst being both the Soviet Union, under whether it was Lenin, Stalin, and the dictators that followed, or under China, the Chinese Communist Party, starting with Mao Zedong, leading up to Xi Jinping's new aggressive approach to communism today. So that's why I think it's so horrible and evil, not just the murders, but the mass detentions of populations in various forms of gulags, and entire approaches to civil oppression that crush all aspects of what we would view in the West as human rights. So the right to religion or free speech or to assemble. None of these are rights that are allowed, much less protected, under a communist regime. And in terms of why people fall prey to this, I think you have to look back to the origins and this kind of false ideology that somehow we as human beings can create this perfect equal world. And of course, everyone loves the idea of equality or equity, but what originated as a focus on class warfare and forcing class equality through communist government state control has now come back today. In the West, what people espouse now are these other approaches to kind of class identity, kind of identity politics, equity at kind of at no limits. No matter what the costs are, we'll take approaches to achieve these outcomes. So I think that's where people get interested in it in terms of the promise of equality and equity. But what they fail to know and understand is that every time this has been tried, this has led to massive, murders and famines and deaths of, millions of people throughout the world in the last century. And it's not that this only happened one time. Every time you've had communist regimes take over, this has been the outcome. And that's why our mission is focused on educating, primarily Americans about these horrible crimes of communism and what this deadly and dangerous ideology has done to the millions of victims around the world.
When you explained that people, fall for this idea that we can create some sort of utopia, heaven on earth, so to speak, and while that might make certain individuals feel good about themselves because they believe they're doing something right. It's impossible to make all things perfect and equal. My father, Dan Weber, would say, that's why we call this earth and not heaven, because on earth there is some suffering. But we do know that communism and socialism, which leads to communism, always, time and time again, leads to death and suffering. And we saw during the Cold War era the threat of communism, and that was such top of mind for many Americans. But now it seems as though people are less aware of what's happening here in America. I want to give you an example. It was the openly socialist elements of the American left that are the most outspoken in their hatred toward Israel. Because days after Hamas launched its assault, the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America rallied in in Times Square to celebrate the Palestinian resistance. And on college campuses, this is now a breeding ground for radical Marxist communist ideology. Many students are blaming Israel for the attack, and many progressive Jews have been profoundly shaken. Is this another manifestation of the divide that we saw emerge in the 1930s and continued to fester during the Cold War when we saw a rise of communism? I guess what I'm asking is, was this affinity for Marxist socialist ideology never really fully extinguished? Because we see it creeping back up here in America today.
Yeah, it's quite surprising. Unfortunately, we know that this ideology has not been extinguished. I grew up as a child in the 1980s. I remember both the leadership of President Reagan and the world leadership of Pope John Paul II at the time that stood against communism at the time, saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, the ending of the Soviet Union, and as we all knew at the time, the end of communism, and that we thought that was the end. And for the last generation, we have not really educated younger Americans about the horrors and evils of communism. And so what we've seen is we've seen this kind of resurgence and new interest in communist ideology and communist forms of government among young people today, frankly, because I think they have not been educated. They don't know the basic facts and history that while maybe this sounds like a great idea, everywhere this has been tried, it has led to untold human suffering. I think we need to step back and look that across human history, most forms of government have been authoritarian of different stripes or the other. And that only in the, relatively speaking, modern period have we in the United States helped develop the wonderful freedoms we in the United States and many around the world enjoy today. And that communist ideology, while newer, draws on and makes worse the most kind of base authoritarian instincts that we had worked to try to block out. As you said, utopians are very dangerous. I certainly agree. And our founders were certainly not utopians. They knew very well the limits and flaws of human nature and constructed a form of government meant to control and counterbalance those impulses. The problem, one of the big problems in communism, is that it actually worsens, heightens, and empowers those impulses in few, dictatorial individuals that use the entire power of the state to control every facet and aspect of human life. So it's no wonder that I think, young people are more interested to those ideologies today. But I think the real solution is to just present them with the facts and history of what are the consequences of those ideologies every time they've been tried in any one of those horrible regimes.
And this is why we love what you're doing. And now today, as you mentioned, it is rebranded as cultural Marxism. Instead of preaching hatred and division between economic classes, today's cultural Marxists are dividing society along racial and ethnic lines, and they're teaching that one's skin color and national origin automatically make them an oppressor or oppressed. And to me, the most shocking thing is how many Americans, particularly young Americans, are warm to the ideas of socialism. They equate it to free healthcare, free education, free anything. As somebody with your experience, why do you think this false narrative that socialism, which always turns to communism, is viewed favorably by the younger people? What's happening in our schools? Where is this coming from?
So I think there's a basic misunderstanding sometimes of what does socialism even mean. Socialism means it starts with the actual state taking control of the means of production and distribution of goods and services in the economy. So young people that may want, higher tax rates, more regulation, more social spending, which from my personal policy perspective, I tend to not want, is not necessarily socialism, right? Every Western democratic country has what I would say guardrails within their debates of, is our taxes should be the higher or lower or spending more, and safeguards that we in a democratic way can put forward policy ideas that can win or lose based on elections and winning the argument. I mean, that's the whole strength of the democratic tradition. The problem with the label of socialism is that it's not just saying, oh, we want to change the spending levels or taxes or regulations one way or the other, which is a fine debate to have. Socialism argues there should be no debate. That what we want one party to control the government, period, and we want the government itself to seize private property and the means of production and distribution of all those goods and services, which immediately lead to totalitarian communist regimes. So I think breaking that divide, explaining that it's fine, it's good, it's healthy for Americans to have what I would call normal political debates on topics like education and healthcare and regulatory policy. We want to wall off the idea that you want absolute government and total control of these sectors in a way that eliminates a private sector and eliminates any kind of check from civil society on the kind of unbridled power of a state authoritarian government.
And so many well-meaning and moral Americans, both on the left and the right, have rightfully reacted with disgust and outrage to people who are embracing that kind of ideology. For so many of our AMAC members, they are discouraged a bit. They might ask you, what would your message be to them about the hope for our future, and how average, ordinary, everyday Americans can play a role?
Well, I am very hopeful for the future of the United States. We are still the most important, most powerful free country around the world. And while we do have challenges domestically, I think it's important for us to focus externally to the largest communist challenge we face around the world today, which is the Chinese Communist Party. Older Americans will have no problem remembering the challenge and threat posed by the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, younger Americans have no memory of that, and it's harder for them to understand and appreciate the challenge posed by the Chinese Communist Party today. While we've not yet entered a kind of clear Cold War that is directly analogous to what many of your audience grew up and remember vividly, that's what we're approaching, and we need leaders today to help younger generations understand the level of threat that the Chinese Communist Party poses to the United States, to our way of life, to our values, to the entire Western world order today, both in terms of their aggressive militarization in the region, their coercive diplomatic policies around the world in both the UN and other multilateral settings, but also in their approaches to developing countries, and also their gross and horrendous human rights violations. Talking to an audience that probably has a lot in retirement accounts, most Americans are financially invested in perpetrators of genocide. And that is unacceptable. Mm-hmm. Americans should not be invested in Chinese CCP-owned companies in China that are committing genocide in Western China today, or are persecuting freedom fighters in Hong Kong, or persecuting house church Christians or the Catholic Church, or going after not just Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in the West, but those in Tibet with ethnic and religious traditions that are independent of China but have been suppressed now for over 70 years. Unfortunately, the list goes on, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the research we've done. But that's, I think, the most important message is that we need to make sure that young people learn today about the challenge that communism poses right now.
Yes, and our listeners are made up of parents and grandparents, and many listening are having that conversation across the dinner table with their grandchild, their son, their daughter. I'd love for you to paint a picture because, for many people, China is a faraway place. They make a lot of things. Everything we turn over, it says made in China. It's hard for people to understand. So my question is, if America were China overnight, what might an ordinary day look for someone who's used to enjoying our God-given freedoms here in America? Like how, if we could just paint that picture, I think our listeners would appreciate that.
Incredibly different. I want to give one specific insight, and then I'll kind of rattle off a longer list of differences. But one that I think hopefully your visitors can resonate with. Many Americans enjoy the freedom of going to any church or house of worship of their choice. So when you go to whatever house of worship you may go to in the next weekend, think, would it be open? Because in many cases they would not, because they have to be licensed and state controlled. When you walk in the door, what images would you see? Would you see the artwork or images of your religious tradition? Or would you see the party-imposed, government-required images of Xi Jinping in your church or house of worship hanging up there, removing pictures of saints or other religious art? Would your pastor or speaker be free to speak? Absolutely not. I mean, just that one lane of what does religion and religious persecution in China look like should be a stark reminder to Americans how blessed we are for the freedoms we have, how cherished those are, and how evil these regimes are. But going beyond that, if you were in an ethnic and religious minority in one distinct geographic part of the country, like in China, in Western China, in Xinjiang, you have massive detention camps. 2 million people have been detained, basically in concentration camp styles, forced into forced labor, both while detained and then after detained, with a aggressive approach to getting personally identifiable information on every adult in entire regions of the country to then assess them for the level of risk they pose to the regime. So we know this is true because here at VOC, we published last year something called the Xinjiang Police Files. A brave hacker in China hacked Chinese police detention facilities and gave us tens of thousands of files, detail, images, spreadsheets, all sorts of documents explaining how they run these massive detention facilities in Western China. And what we were able to see was that in 2 counties, they had processed for detention 95% of all adults to determine what level of risk they had, and then chose to detain 15% of the entire adult population in these counties, based on their level of threat, meaning that they were religious or that they had traveled internationally or expressed interest in religion from either to a grandparent or someone else, or had grown a beard or read a Quran. So the level of surveillance that takes place both in Western China and Xinjiang, and now they've exported to other parts of the country, really limit anyone's ability to travel or to gather in any way that would not create great suspicion. They have created an entire, I could go on, I don't want to answer too long, but an entire system of
This is so
of a
important.
social credit score where they can assess how much risk you pose to the regime based on your behavior, both in the real world or online or on a phone, which of course there is no privacy in terms of what you may say or who you're in contact with. Mm-hmm. And that will affect your ability to travel or to get a job or to purchase certain things. So the level of oppression is stark. All of your listeners, of course, that remember the stories from behind the Iron Curtain and what happened in the Soviet times, whether in the Gulag or just the overall repression under the Soviet system. Imagine that now with 21st century technology, machine learning, AI tools, and surveillance cameras scattered across the entire country. How much worse and more oppressive that is today in China than it ever was in the Soviet Union. And of course, having something like that on our shores is unthinkable, which is why we are so dedicated to our mission and think it's so important that we make sure that all Americans learn these valuable lessons.
It is so important that people understand exactly what it means to live under that type of tyranny. And I do want to just share this quickly. I was at the nail salon, this is several months back, and the gal who does my nails, her parents are in China, and she says she speaks to them every day. And we were chit-chatting, and she told me a very personal story. When she was 7 years old, and I'm guessing she's somewhere in her early 40s, when she was 7 years old, she said that her mother, she's the only child. She said when she was 7, her mother was pregnant. Her mother decided to have the baby, but it was not approved that the mother could have a second child at this time. When that mom was 7 months pregnant, she was home most of the time and she would hide her pregnancy. She went out, someone ratted on her, and this woman who's here in America today, who was doing my nails, said to me, they came in when we lived in China and they took my mother away. And I didn't see her for a couple of days. And when she came back, she was no longer pregnant. It was a boy, she said, and my parents were devastated. I mean, people have to understand that when a country says we own you and everything that you say, your future is what we dictate. We own your children. We decide what goes in every textbook you read. We tell you what you can and can't worship. This is real. This is something that, people think, what keeps us free here in America? It's the people who are fighting for our freedom. So I just want to encourage everyone out there that, freedom, it cannot be taken lightly. We've got to fight for it every day, every year, because it could be gone so quickly, as Ronald Reagan so eloquently said. I never get the quote just right, but he made a really good point that it's got to be fought for generation after generation. Otherwise, our children and our grandchildren will be told stories of a day when America was once free. I am so glad that you're doing this work, sir. Before I let you go, can you tell us about any new initiatives underway or any parting message that you would like to leave with our AMAC members?
Well, one, I'd love to invite all your members, whenever you come to Washington, D.C., to please come visit us at the Victims of Communism Museum. You can find us on our website and check out our social media as well at VO Communism. And our website is victimsofcommunism.org. So I'd welcome you all to check out our website and, of course, come visit us here at the museum. And in terms of other new initiatives, we have new exhibits on display here at the museum that have changed. Where our current exhibit is one on the Ukraine Holodomor, the mass state-imposed famine in Ukraine back in the 1930s under Stalin that killed millions of people. And then please follow our China research. As I already expressed, we've uncovered incredible evidence and research on the crimes against humanity taking place in China today, and we will have new papers and reports out next year. We continue to work with governments around, the U.S. government in particular, and other governments around the world, trying to bring to their attention all of these human rights abuses, because we need our policymakers to make clear, concrete actions to take a stand against these abuses by China and the CCP in particular. So we continue to work with the U.S. government and other governments on this. And the last thing I'd leave with your listeners is, in terms of what we can do to reach young people today, I think the most important tool is that they need to learn about this in school. Just like I think we've done a great job mostly teaching young Americans about the Holocaust in school, we need to do an equally good job making sure that every young person learns and hears about the victims of communism as part of their formal education. So if you reach out to your own school boards, reach out to your state governments, and encourage them to make sure that students learn about that. We were so pleased to see, both in the state of Florida and the state of Arizona, their legislatures passed laws requiring that all public schools teach about the victims of communism. And we think that's something that can be replicated around the country.
That is just terrific. Thank you so much. We so appreciate you being here with us and bringing important, light to this topic. 100 million victims of communism around the world. Unbelievable. Sir, thank you for pursuing the freedom of those still living under totalitarian regimes. And God bless you.
Thank you.
Have you ever wished someone could plan your dream vacation? Colette Guided Travel comes with benefits that will take your guided travel experience to another level. You'll experience must-sees and connect with the people and the culture that define a destination. You'll eat in locals' homes, take cooking classes, travel by trains, and even stay in igloos, castles, or chateaus. With over 175 tours to all 7 continents and 5 distinct travel styles, Colette has the tour for you. Plus, AMAC members save an extra $50 to $100 off every tour. Go ahead and visit Colette.com/AMAC to learn more.